So we're ending chapter 16 with the slave revolution in Haiti. And this isn't totally separate from what we were talking about in the last video with the French Revolution because Haiti was a French colony. And it's important to remember that in the slave plantations of the Caribbean, slave revolts were common. They were feared and they were ruthlessly suppressed. And probably one of the most brutal plantation systems was the one in the colony of Saint Domingue, which is also called Haiti. By 1791, in this colony, there were 500,000 slaves. The remarkable thing is that of other people living there were 40,000. So look at this ratio. It would make sense that the 40,000 would fear the uprising of the 500,000 slaves. Not to mention, these people were brutally treated. So even those who decided to rebel really had nothing to lose. I mean, death probably was not the worst thing they had experienced. So forms of escape for slaves were voodoo, which is like a mixture of African religion and Catholicism, maroonage, which was leaving the plantation and fleeing to the hills. The people who did that were called maroons. And then colonization by some of the maroons. They would go start another colony. There was one guy, Francois Mackendal, who built a large maroon colony network that resisted slavery. And he had planned to poison the water supply, but was captured and burned at the stake in 1751. So the slave revolt. Because remember, this was a slave revolt that led to independence. Began in 1791, and slave revolts broke out simultaneously across Saint Domingue. And the causes of this were they wanted personal freedom, and that was the main one. But also they had heard, or maybe had heard, of the French and American revolutions. It's not likely, but it could have happened, which would have made them want to have their own revolution for independence from France. So these bands of maroon warriors rose up and, using a guerrilla warfare style of fighting, began an armed struggle and a civil war. And the white planters, or the 40,000, were terrified of this. And so they were hoping and received the support of the British soldiers, keeping in mind that during this time, Britain and France did not get along. So part of the British coming was to help oust the French. But they came to help the white planters and also to drive out the French. In this is sort of just random side fact. You've probably seen the term mulattoes in your book. Mulattoes were they were a mixture of colonists and natives. And the mulattoes were free. Some of them actually even owned slaves. So they were divided over the issue. The guy who really rose up to become the leader of this was a guy named Toussaint Louverture. And I'm going to spell that for you. Toussaint Louverture. And he was a freed black who allied with Spanish rulers against the slave system and against the French. And the way he gained support was by using rhetoric from the French Revolution. And so in 1794, France actually abolished slavery in all of the French colonies. And so Louverture then linked himself to France against slavery and the British. And so by May 1800, Toussaint Louverture became the ruler of Saint Domingue. So after slavery had been abolished in 1794, Napoleon came to power and he reversed the policy on slavery. And on top of that, he dispatched 20,000 French troops to go to the island to recapture the slaves and to reinstitute slavery. And in the middle of that, Toussaint Louverture was imprisoned and eventually exiled to France in 1802. And so the fight against France continued. And black and mulatto armies defeated the French. It was the armies, but it was also disease. 50,000 people died of yellow fever, and thousands more were military casualties. So on January 1st, 1804, Saint Domingue was proclaimed independent and took on the name Haiti, which means mountain. And this was really the only successful slave revolution in history. Okay, so eventually the British were on the side of the 40,000. Remember, they had come, intervened in Saint Domingue on behalf of the 40,000. So initially they helped try to put down the slave rebellion. In 1807, though, they limited the spread of slavery, which showed that they began to fear further slave revolts. And this undoubtedly had to do with this slave rebellion that turned into independence for a colony. And so they limited the spread of slavery in the British Empire. And in 1833, they actually abolished slavery throughout the empire. Now, freed slaves did have to work for their former masters for a time to compensate for quote-unquote lost property. But they did this slave rebellion brought fear to the British. The U.S. feared slave revolts as well, and so they stopped trading with Haiti in 1806. In 1808, the U.S. outlawed participation in the international slave trade. Now, slavery continued to grow by natural production, but they stopped the slave trade. And of course, the trade didn't end completely until slavery was abolished in the 70s and 80s by Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Brazil. Independence and disillusionment in Latin America, 1810 to 1830. So between 1810 and 1826, almost all Latin American countries got rid of their European leaders and established their independence. And they drew their inspiration from the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and even the Haitian Revolution. All of Latin America, pretty much except for Brazil, was under the control of Spain. And these liberators just used military skill and diplomatic accomplishments to achieve independence. So independence movements. So by and large, the early revolts were unsuccessful, and that was because Spain and Portugal were still very powerful nations. It was really the Napoleonic Wars in Spain that gave Latin American colonies the chance to revolt, with the Creoles leading the way. Now remember, the Creoles were Spanish or European in blood, but they were born in the colonies. So they were, again, European according to their blood and their family, but they had lived all of their lives, and they were born in the colonies. And one such Creole was a guy named Simon Bolivar. And this is our famous leader of independence, probably Simon. Simon Bolivar was the son of a Venezuelan Creole aristocrat, and he had gone over to Europe to study philosophy, and in 1807 he returned to Venezuela just as France was beginning to defeat Spain in the Napoleonic Wars, and he came back to Venezuela and joined the independence movements. Now, after an unsuccessful attempt at securing independence, he did receive money and military backup from Haiti and Great Britain in exchange for freeing South American slaves. But by 1825, Bolivar successfully captured Peru and what was considered Upper Peru and renamed it Bolivia for obvious reasons, and became the president of both. and he actually wanted to unite the region, but fighting amongst his generals prevented that from happening. Interestingly, Bolivar survived an assassination attempt in 1828, but then died 2 years later from tuberculosis. So his dream of a unified Grand Colombia eventually just dissolved into Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador. And eventually 18 nations emerged from South America. And warfare among these states led to the leadership of caudillos. And caudillos were pretty much like military leaders, military dictators, that kind of thing. So that brings us to Mexico, or independence in Mexico. So early Mexican independence movements were different than the South American independence movements because of their lack of Creole elite. Father Miguel Hidalgo actually led the first wave of revolts, but was executed in 1811. So Father Jose Maria Morales took command, and he wanted to abolish slavery. He wanted to displace the elites, revoke church land and privilege, but the Spanish church executed him in 1821. So when Mexico finally claimed its independence in 1821, it was controlled by the Creoles, who established a monarchical government. So they had a king. This lasted for 2 years before it was replaced by a republic. And the Central American region of Mexico broke away and formed a union, which dissolved really quickly. And then Mexico had another blunder when Texas declared its independence from Mexico a few years later in 1836, so they lost a large chunk of land there. And then in the Mexican-American War, the U.S. gained the current southwestern states from Mexico as well. So they did achieve their independence in 1821, but shortly after that, they lost a significant amount of land. So Brazil has an even different story, followed a much different pattern of independence than Mexico or the South American states. When Napoleon invaded Portugal in 1807, the ruling family was terrified and fled to Brazil, the Portuguese colony of Brazil. And so with the ruling family there, it raised Brazil's legal status to that equal to Portugal, and it expanded into a center of trade, administration, education, and cultural institutions. And so in 1821, the threat of Napoleon was gone, so the king returned to Portugal and left his son, Prince Pedro, in Rio de Janeiro. I'm sure I butchered that. And in 1822, Pedro declared Brazil independent. He was American-born, and he declared independence, and nothing really was done to stop him. And so he was crowned the constitutional emperor, but the effective rulers were actually the Monzambos. I'll put this up here. And the Mazambos were Portuguese, American-born elites. So sort of like Creoles in the Spanish colonies. So after independence, religious and economic issues. Many of these new nations that had recently achieved their independence wanted to increase their own power. And so the way they did that was by breaking the authority of the church. So they confiscated church lands, they refused to collect church taxes, they declared a voice in the clergy, and they limited control or clerical control over educational facilities. Economically speaking, Latin America remained mostly agrarian, and they had the hacienda, which is kind of like a feudal estate. Most of the haciendados were Creole, and their workers were either mestizo or Indian. Eventually, Great Britain came to dominate Latin America, even though they had achieved their independence. They came to dominate them through economic investment and control. For instance, by 1834, there were 100 British commercial firms staffed by 3,000 British citizens in Latin America. So this is what's been called neo-colonialism or new colonialism. They didn't control them politically, but they controlled them economically. And so this brings our chapter 16 video lecture to an end.